Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking to you from Washington, D.C. The Ukrainian crisis rolls on. I will direct, if I may, your kind attention to my website, tarpley.net, where by the time you hear this broadcast, we will have posted a major essay by me on the history of Ukraine. I'll try to give you some more samples of that towards the end of this program, if we can eke out the time from the busy world theater going on around us. But the principal insights that would be added to what we already had last week come from John Wheeler Bennett, British agent, in some ways the central figure of the network that produced Henry Kissinger later on. But his book, The Forgotten Peace, Brest-Litovsk, 1918, a discussion of what was actually going on in Eastern Europe, European Russia, during 1918, 1919, the time when we had the first appearance of Ukraine, the first time Ukraine ever got on the map, the first time that Ukraine during 1919 was self-governing. And, of course, we had pogroms. We had this Simon Petliura starting with his massacres of Jews and others, but also Poles, and tremendous hostility to Russians. So do take a look. In the past week, we've been hearing again this idiotic, imbecilic mantra of NATO and U.S. propaganda. There are no fascists in Ukraine. There are no fascists in the Ukrainian government. We heard that again this morning on National Public Radio on the Diane Rehm weekly international hour. No fascists? Well, right sector would beg to differ. Those right sector fascists, neo-Nazis or Nazis, paleo-Nazis, some of them, they are in a furor after the killing of the Nazi thug Muzichko, or Muzichka, and what they had this past weekend and into this week, the Kiev Rada, the parliament, self-styled, was surrounded by fascist gangs attempting to impose the ouster of the interior minister, blamed by the right sector, by Yarosh and his gang, for having killed their man Muzichka. So we had those fascists on parade. They were all over the place. They were holding the parliament at gunpoint, as they did finally in the late months of Yanukovych. Although this time there are no police left. There's no Berkut. There's nothing left to try to stop them. So there are plenty of fascists. No threats? Well, there are no threats to the Russian minority or the Russian population of eastern Ukraine. Why do we have Timoshenko, the kleptocratic gas princess and darling of NATO and great friend of Merkel? Why is Timoshenko threatening to use nuclear weapons for genocide and ethnic cleansing against the Russians of East Ukraine? How can that be? And not a word about it, of course, from the NATO media. So there's plenty wrong. I would urge the following. Rather than go down the path of the warmongers, as we heard on National Public Radio this morning, National Pentagon Radio, with the BBC, interestingly, the British have come into their own, right? That hostility, that implacable conflict between the Russian Empire and the British Empire in the 19th century is still alive culturally. It's a tropism. It's a Pavlovian reaction. I would propose to anybody of goodwill in the world, and in particular to people in the United States who can influence to some degree the political events here, you need to support, in a general sense, what Putin is doing. It doesn't mean you have to support every piece of idiocy that comes out of the mouth of some dubious character on some allegedly Russian television network. No, you don't have to support every piece of imbecility from Abby Martin. It doesn't mean that at all. It simply means that the general nature of the project is beneficial for the world. What are the benefits of Putin in the general sense? First of all, we have seen since 1991 that the unipolar world is not viable. It's not workable. This is not ideology. This is simply a practical observation. The problem is that the ruling elite of the United States lacks the necessary wisdom. There was some wisdom during the Cold War. It was induced by big, dirty Soviet ICBMs and H-bombs. But since that threat has receded, at least in the minds of these characters, the worst possible tendencies of the U.S. ruling class have come to the fore. They have been elicited. They have been evoked by this unipolar situation. I don't know anybody in the world that would have done better if you had the Chinese elite, or for that matter, the Russian elite, or German, or whatever, Japanese, it doesn't matter, Brazil. Any elite put in this unipolar position is going to witness its own worst tendencies become dominant, or at least strive and contend for domination. But in the case of the United States, concretely, what we've lived through now in the past quarter century is that without the counterbalancing force of the USSR, and with Russia in a position of weakness and having lost the initiative, the worst tendencies have come out in the U.S. And these are the neocons, on the one hand, the right-wing warmongers, the pro-Israeli faction of the United States, but not only that, right, the ones who want to follow the Nazi recipe, really, of Carl Schmitt and Leo Strauss, that conflict is needed, the Nietzschean recipe, I guess you'd say, the Nietzschean Carl Schmitt, Leo Strauss faction here in the United States, wishing to organize everything around enemy image, Feindbild, and therefore to run this society on an oligarchical basis using the pretext of this foreign enemy. And we've also had on the other side the left warmongers. We've seen them more clearly in the past couple of years since Obama came in, as I warned. The left warmongers for Obama, the way they see it, the human rights people, the humanitarian interventionists, the lunatics like Samantha Power, the loopy crackpot speaking for the United States at the United Nations. These two mentally deranged groups in their own geopolitical estimations, right? You got the neocons and then the responsibility to protect people, the R2P group. Between them, we see that the worst tendencies of the entire ideological spectrum come to the fore. What is needed is the traditional recipe, the balance of power, a counterweight. Who can provide the counterweight? Who has the political maturity, a certain amount of economic power, a certain amount of economic independence, a certain amount of cultural tradition? It's Russia. It's the unconquered country, right? Remember, the unconquered countries, the ones who have not been overrun in the last 1,000 years or so, or, well, not quite 1,000 years, but let's say 500 years, or thereabouts anyway. It gets you down to the United States, Great Britain, and Russia. These are special countries in that regard. We need the power of Russia to be revived. A strong Russia is a great help for a striking worker in Chicago or Los Angeles or New York. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Keep up with what you hear about on the radio here at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net, and that includes this article on the minimal, feeble basis of Ukrainian nationality. The fact that Ukraine is a puppet state set up by the German General Staff, by Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff, during World War I for the purposes of getting food. It is the delicatessen of the German General Staff, the supermarket of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, a supermarket chain, 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, and so forth. This was the price of recognition of the Ukrainian Rada, February 1918. Now, getting back to the Putin question, first of all, the need to balance the United States, to suppress and to muffle these awful atavistic tendencies. In other words, the atavism is here. The neocons have essentially shaken the foundations of the modern world, and then they're joined by the responsibility to protect humanitarian intervention, cement the power crackpots. The benchmark is the United Nations Charter. Interference in the internal affairs of sovereign states is inadmissible. Force and the threat of force are inadmissible. And then we had the Non-Proliferation Treaty. United States, nuclear state, cannot, under the nuclear non-proliferation, go around threatening non-nuclear states. Once you do that, you've knocked the entire world out of kilter. So Putin is the sole effective antidote to that. We need Putin to remain resolute because this suppresses these awful heteronomic and catastrophic tendencies of the U.S. Now, a second point is in the very specifics of the Ukrainian situation. We do not want a rebirth of fascism. Speaking of atavisms, the return of fascism and Nazism and anti-Semitism and racism and Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts of the Muzichko type, the right sector group, but also Svoboda, and everything that they represent culturally and politically. This must be nipped in the bud. Ukrainian fascism must be strangled in the cradle. Principiis obsta, right? Während den Anfängen. That was the sad lesson for Germany after the seizure of power in 1933. You've got to nip this in the bud because all of a sudden, like the September 1930 elections in Germany, right? The Nazis went from being kind of a nuisance and a curiosity to being a real threat to seize power. So we want the Ukrainian fascists crushed, quite simply, right? We want them to be deprived of the ability to influence world affairs. We don't want the ability to unleash World War III in the hands of some lunatic of the Chanibok Yarosh model. And I mentioned them as the head of Svoboda and the head of the right sector, respectively. We cannot have these people affecting and impacting the destiny of the world. And then, just to make this accounting a little bit simpler than it might be, a third point is the one that's posed to every individual, and that is to say the human qualities, the moral and intellectual qualities of the U.S. ruling elite, and how degenerate they are, and how decadent they are, and how hysterical, and how they are the ones who have turned their backs on reality as a matter of philosophical method, right? Remember, they are in the Nietzschean Schopenhauer realm. They believe in the world as will and imagination. You make your own world by your own purely gratuitous and heteronomic or existential actions. Take, for example, we compare Obama and Putin, and we see who is morally and intellectually superior. I don't think there's any doubt. Again, I'm not in the business of demonizing Obama. I tried to warn against Obama when there was time to prevent him from being inflicted on the world. But now that train has left the station, and at the moment, in the face of the Romney forces, the madmen of the type of the neocons, the Kagans, the Seniors, the Josephs, and so on, the Krauthammers, so on down the line, those guys are worse than Obama right now. Obama has been to some degree, domesticated by the powers of the presidency. In other words, the system designed by John Adams on the basis of Machiavelli has essentially made Obama into, if not a break, at least a kind of a passive lump on the path to war. Right? He's not pushing it. The push is coming from elsewhere. The Republican Party has dropped all pretense of libertarianism. They are on the road as a warmonger party once again. Did the Republicans fool you? They didn't fool me. Did Rand Paul fool you? No. The closer they get to power, or they think they're getting to power, the more warmonger they are. That is a fool's errand. Anybody who believes that garbage. And you saw at the beginning of this crisis, little Rand Paul making some noises, oh, let's not overdo it. And then as he saw that his Republican lunatic base were showing their true warmonger colors, right? Marijuana and war is now the winning libertarian formula. Well, then little Rand began running. He began to get his helmet and his bayonet and his Confederate flag or whatever he has, and marching off to the Ukraine. So that's a bad situation. So Obama's not the worst. But when we compare Obama to Putin, it's clear that from a human, moral, intellectual point of view, Putin is superior. There's no doubt about it. Let's take another one. Let's compare Kerry, the blasé, skull and bones, rich boy who gambles with other people's lives, other people's money. I think I've told the story about his crash in Bretagne, in Brittany, France, in the mid-'60s in the summer, accompanied by a guy that I knew from high school, and how he almost ended his career right there, right, driving way too fast. And then there's another story about him going under the Golden Gate Bridge in an airplane, accompanied by the later U.S. ambassador to Italy. As we have the famous quotation from F. Scott Fitzgerald talking to Ernest Hemingway, the rich are not like us, Ernie. And Ernie doesn't get it. Ernie is quite dumb compared to Scott. Ernie says, yeah, they have more money. And Scott says, no, it's much more than just that. It's a whole cultural mindset. So, in that sense, it's clear. Lavrov, as an intellectual, as a person of courage and resources, is humanly superior to Kerry. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So once again, the benefits of Putin and why you should resist the Russophobic hysteria engulfing the United States. You need a balance. You need a counterweight to suppress the warmonger lunatic tendencies in the U.S. elite, be they neocons or the humanitarian interventionists. Secondly, it is in the interest of the world for this rebirth of fascism to be crushed, to be neutralized, liquidated, whatever it is. Remember that when General Badoglio turned to the king and said 5 minutes of gunfire, fascism is over. Think about what that would have meant. No march on Rome, no Mussolini, no fascism means no Nazism, no Hitler, no World War II. So in terms of historical morality, would Badoglio have been on the right side of the angels if the 5 minutes of gunfire had dispersed the ragamuffin gutter snipe legions of Il Duce, who was hiding near the Swiss border at the time? I think you can see, in terms of the historical potentials involved, it's an interesting proposition. Anyway, Obama inferior to Putin, Kerry inferior to Lavrov, and then let's even take, let's go to the UN. Let's compare Churkin, Vitaly Churkin, the Russian delegate, to our dear loopy Samantha Power. Now, I've criticized Churkin. He has not been an Adlai Stevenson at the Cuban Missile Crisis. He could have brought the tapes, the various tapes. He could have brought the Nuland tape in there and played it. He could have brought the Estonian foreign minister in there, talking to Madame Ashton, Baroness Ashton, about how the anti-Yanukovych forces were sponsoring the snipers. There's an attempt to deny that now, but the world knows. He could have done something similar to Adlai Stevenson, bringing in the photographs of the U.S., the surveillance photos of the Soviet missiles in Cuba in October of 1962. Didn't do that, but still, you compare him to the loopy, crackpot Samantha Power with her self-righteous, hysterical posturing, all the while sporting that ravaged look. We don't want to speculate here on the family program about what that ravaged look might have been caused by, but you get the idea. Churkin is a normal, functionary diplomat making the case for his country as best he can. I would say it's too narrow, it's too formalistic, but still, you compare him, Samantha Power's a raving lunatic. So if you don't like these sociopathic tendencies coming to the fore in the U.S. elite, then the only conceivable antidote is Putin. Now, Putin, however, falls short in certain areas. It doesn't mean that you're giving him a 100% endorsement. Let me just point out, we have this interesting campaign. I have two documents that go in this direction. First of all, we have Anne Applebaum, and if you're a regular listener, you know that Anne Applebaum is Madame Sikorsky. She's married. She's given up telling you this in every column now, but Anne Applebaum is the wife of the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorsky, who is one of the signatories of the February 21st deal that was supposed to cool the Kiev situation, right? The Maidan was supposed to go home, and elections were scheduled, and that was signed by Fabius of France, Steinmeier of Germany, and Sikorsky of Poland. And this is Madame Sikorsky writing to us here, Washington Post, Sunday, March 30th. Russia's anti-Western thinking takes hold. So somehow she's talking to a lawyer from Georgetown who has a shtick about LGBT, and somehow from Georgia, which is an enemy of Russia, she manages to generalize that the entire Russian Federation is mobilized against LGBT and homosexuals. And she also goes through the various right-wing groups, Jobbik of Hungary, Marine Le Pen, who just Marine Le Pen had a very limited, shabby success. She got 15 cities of the lower middle rank, couldn't take Paris, couldn't take Marseille, couldn't take Lyon. Not so great. But anyway, you get the idea that there's this awful tide of cultural backlash against the Anglo-American world, and somehow Putin is to be associated with that. But now, even more interesting, far more so, Masha Gessen on Monday, March 31st, the day after, and writing from the same printout, Masha Gessen goes back, and I think for the first time, reports to the benighted readers of the Washington Post that Putin gave a speech in December where he pointed out that Russia does not claim a global or regional hegemony, but will strive to be leaders of a certain current of opinion, and therefore presumably a block of countries in the world in an informal sense, right? Not the Warsaw Pact, but a bunch of countries that tend to converge on practical points. So Putin says, and I'm going to read you these because this is the first time these quotes have ever been in the Washington Post. So Russia should be a world leader. This is, now quoting from Putin, quote, "This is absolutely objective and understandable for a state like Russia with its great history and culture, with many centuries of experience, not of so-called tolerance, neutered and barren, but of the real organic life of different peoples existing together within the framework of a single state." Now, somehow, this Masha Gessen of the, well, he's a biographer of Putin, I guess. He's a professional Putinophobe, that somehow this is code word for LGBT. I'm not sure I see it. And then he goes on. Today, many nations are revising their moral values and ethical norms. eroding ethnic traditions and differences between peoples and cultures. Society is now required not only to recognize everyone's right to the freedom of conscience. I think it's wrong in the text, but I think he's talking about freedom of conscience, meaning of religion, political views, and privacy. But, says Putin, you're also supposed to accept without question the equality of good and evil. Strange as it seems, concepts that are opposite in meaning. Well, the Anglo-American cultural synthesis of Anglo-American liberalism in the most general sense, left-wing liberals, right-wing liberals, reactionaries, but all liberals. What is the basis of this? Two things, I think. The first is that financiers ought to rule the world. That compared to anybody else, generals, bureaucrats, demagogues, priests, whatever it is, that the best ruling class you can get, according to the Anglo-American liberal, is a banker. And therefore they think Soros should rule the world, and oligarchs and whatever. In other words, the whole British system, the Venetian Constitution, as Benjamin Disraeli put it. Okay, and the second point of liberalism is there are no objective criteria of good and evil. That is wrong. I can derive objective good and evil and objective human rights out of the needs of production, economic growth, scientific, technological, and industrial progress. All of those dictate a high regard for the individual, for longevity, for education, for a personal sphere of rights, and so forth. And those are objective. They are not simply bleeding heart labels or wishes tacked on to a historical process that's going somewhere else. My categories of good and evil are rooted in production, economic life, and the needs thereof. So, Masha Gelman thinks that Putin is trying to marshal the anti-Western forces of the globe. Well, you want to do that, you better have an alternative to economic globalization. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. So if Putin, responding here to Masha Gelman in the Washington Post, Monday, March 31st, if Putin is supposed to be the leader of an anti-Western bloc of states, the leader of the anti-Western world, the elementary necessity, which still has to be addressed, is an alternate monetary system, an alternative to economic globalization. Now here, the Chinese, unfortunately, have perhaps don't have the clarity either. You might look to them to solve this, right? You'd say, well, the anti-Western bloc of states, in a sense of an alternative to the failed leadership of the Anglo-American elite and the failure of their neoliberal ideas, would be the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and some others around that, Iran coming in, and so forth. But in order to do that, you've got to have an idea of a new world monetary system. And unfortunately, despite what Medvedev thought, it's not enough to make a little coin. You've got to have markets. You've got to have treasury bond markets that routinely do $1 trillion a day and can handle anything up to $4 to $5 trillion in a day, if you want to have the breadth and depth to have a reserve currency. Where's your reserve currency? And the other thing I would say is the BRICS Bank. Remember, there was supposed to be this alternative to the World Bank International Monetary Fund called the BRICS Bank. We haven't heard from them. Are they going to act on Egypt, for example? Egypt has been bailed out by Saudi Arabia for the moment, but how long will that last? How long will the Saudi regime last? And then other countries, right? If you had Ukraine and you wanted to stabilize Ukraine or even Crimea, you're going to need an investment program, a Marshall Plan. Marshall plans will not come from the IMF, nor will they come from the World Bank or the International Finance Association, of anything of that sort. So if Putin wants to be, and I hope he has some concept in this direction, the leader of an anti-Western bloc, it's going to take a decisive break with neoliberal economics, economic globalization, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, given the power of the pro-Medvedev faction inside Russia, the entire direction of Russian policy of the last several years, anyway, until only yesterday, has been to join, to become integrated into that world system. So now you're talking about, hopefully, a reversal of that direction towards an alternative. The world needs an alternative, and an alternative certainly could come from the BRICS, but it's going to require a much greater programmatic power and thrust than we've seen so far. Now, obviously, we applaud what Putin has done so far. He has obviously accomplished a lot with means that are not super abundant. He's done much with little. The great commanders often do it this way. Let me just go back to Masha Gelman and one or two other points. The idea here is that Putin is leading a bloc which is interesting. He says, here's Putin again, I'm going to quote him, "We know that there are more and more people in the world who support our position on defending traditional values. Russia's role is to prevent movement backward and downward into chaotic darkness and a return to a primitive state." That is very, very germane. The chaotic darkness and the primitive state are essentially the new dark age that is conjured up by this program of destroying the nation states, right, which is the CIA, State Department, NATO program, and the creation of microstates, mini-states, failed states, rump states, chaos, warlords. You've seen it from Iraq to Libya to Sudan to Kosovo, now Scotland, now Ukraine. They did it. And therefore, the problem is with Masha Gelman. Masha Gelman can only understand this in terms of sexual identity. This is a key to the impoverishment of the Anglo-American or Western spirit, that they can't imagine traditional values as being anything but homophobia. Wait a minute. How about some other traditional values? How about a traditional value that there is right and wrong? How about a traditional value that the nation state is a good thing and it's better to be patriotic and support your country in a constructive way, not as a jingo, but as a country. Each country undoubtedly has something unique to contribute to human development. There are very few exceptions. And therefore, that would be a traditional value. Or the implementation of science, technology, and industry can improve the human condition. Traditional value. So it's broader than just LGBT. Anyway, this is obviously a campaign, right? When you get Madame Sikorsky-Applebaum on Sunday and Masha Gelman on Monday with the same printout, that's a campaign, and this is one of the reasons why we should be willing to counter it. Now, looking a little bit further here, we had last week this infamous telephone call by Davutoglu. It's some kind of a Turkish government conference call or meeting or something of this sort, where Davutoglu and one of the leading Turkish spooks says, we can send 4 men into Syria, get them to fire rockets at Turkey, and then we'll have the pretext for war, which Recep Erdogan, lightheaded Recep, is looking for, right? So this is very serious, needless to say. They're talking about arranging a false flag, right? We had this in the Downing Street memorandum of Tony Blair and Mad Dog Bush the Younger. Now we've got it again. But remember, if you're listening to all of this from a NATO country, they're playing with your future. Turkey has been in NATO from the very beginning. You can't do that, Davutoglu. We got you dead to rights. Now, Erdogan has said, well, he wants to shut down Twitter, he wants to shut down Facebook because they're telling that he's corrupt. Yeah, corrupt. I'm sure he's corrupt. But that's an internal matter. Once you get to this false flag, warmonger, Sarajevo trigger, there's a new Sarajevo right there, just a little bit further southeast, right? As Bismarck said, don't get a world war going based on some stupid thing in the Balkans. Well, don't get it on some stupid thing in Anatolia or the Levant either. So the U.S. media, silent as a tomb. They say, he's accused of being corrupt. And then one of them, I think France 24, says, then he's accused of doing something with a meeting of that Twitter is accused of reporting the contents of a secret government meeting. But they don't tell you what it was, even though the French would be dragged in under the failed leadership of Hollande as much as anybody else. Now, Davutoglu is doubling down. He is escalating. He is not chastened. He has learned nothing. So we have this strange issue, which is not well known. It is the tomb of Suleiman Shah, S-H-A-H. So Suleiman Shah is the father of Osman I, the founder of the Ottoman Empire, right? Osmanisches Reich. So Osman I has his father, Suleiman Shah, but the tomb of Suleiman Shah is in Syria. It is an exclave from the Turkish point of view. From the point of view of Syria, it's an enclave, and then alleged, right? Because the exact legal status of this is, well, anybody's guess. But the idea is that Turkey has declared unilaterally, I think is the overwhelming case. Turkey has said to Syria, watch out, the tomb of Suleiman Shah, even though it's located in your big city of Aleppo, we consider that sovereign territory of Turkey. And now we get our warmonger friend Davutoglu saying Turkey will respond if Syria does anything to disturb the tomb of Suleiman Shah, or if Al-Qaeda does, or if anybody does. Back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. In these days, we're marking 65 years of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Atlantic Alliance, 1949, Dean Acheson. And 15 years since the bombing of Serbia, that colossal act of historical vandalism by NATO, blowing up the bridges over the Danube. And, of course, Amanpour and our dear friend Lupi Samantha Power were a key part of that, right? The myth of the 100,000 dead Kosovars that was dished up by Amanpour and dear Lupi, Mrs. Cass Sunstein, alias Samantha Power. NATO has morphed into something ugly. At the beginning, you could make a case for it in the 50s. There was the Red Army. There were nuclear weapons there in the Soviet Union, and they were a few miles from the main cities of Germany in particular. The Fulda Gap, the Ljubljana Gap, all of these areas were real. But it's when you get the NATO out-of-area deployments, right? Remember, the slogan in the 80s was out of area or out of business. In other words, that NATO would wither on the vine, as it should have, unless it could become something for the Malvinas, Falklands, for the areas like Afghanistan, which have no part of the original purview of the NATO alliance. The U.S. had insisted on a restricted definition of where NATO applied, so the U.S. didn't want to get dragged into colonial wars, say, by the French in Indochina or by the British somewhere or the Portuguese or any of the other NATO members. But now we can see the reductio ad absurdum of all this. What can we say to Davutoglu when he says that he, and this is amazing, he's playing with your life. The posturing Davutoglu, trying to detract attention from his taped conversations where he's setting up a false flag. Davutoglu vowed to respond to attacks against the tomb of Suleiman Shah as it would against any other part of Turkish soil. When a missile is launched into Turkey by the Syrian regime or by the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, or Sham and Levant, Iraq and Sham, or any other element, we will act equally in return. So he's basically saying, you, Western Europe, you, U.S., you, Canada, you're all my auxiliaries because I'm going to go on this lunatic provocateur policy. Now, this is unfortunate because Turkey was a key part of NATO from the very beginning, but with this kind of stuff, this is going to have to be shut down now. We cannot once again have petty, tin pot, demagogue, militarists, warmongers, racists, fascists, be they in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, or in Poland, or in Turkey, or any of these frontline states, if they want to call themselves that. We can't have this. We can't be dragged into war by these lunatics, right? And, of course, the politics of these countries are anybody's guess. Now,